December 1944 pressed down on the Ardennes like a roof of leaden cloud. The firs and beeches stood thin and stark, their limbs etched against a sky swollen with snow. Wind slid through the woods like a blade, shunting flakes sideways so they skittered along the crusted ground. Under a web of netting mottled with frost inside an M10 Wolverine whose steel felt colder than river ice, Private First Class Ray Thompson peered through a fog-smeared periscope. Each breath he exhaled frosted the eyepiece. His gloved fingers trembled because the cold gnawed at them and at the hull and at his bones, not because fear had unsteadied his will. 800 yards ahead, a German armored column wound through the timbered cut like a metal serpent. He counted a dozen machines, mostly Panzer IVs, with one heavy Tiger stalking at the point. Behind the tanks clattered half-tracks packed with infantry, and farther back labored fuel and ammunition lorries that kept the serpent alive. Their axis was a vital crossroads, a road that, if seized, would sever the lifeline feeding the 101st Airborne Division, already ringed in Bastogne. He had no fire authority. His assignment was to watch, to track, to report. Orders said, "Hold your fire." He could see the arc of consequences settling like snow before him. He could also see that waiting would invite disaster to walk in. So he did the thing the manual forbade. Without a word from anyone above, without permission from anyone at all, Ray Thompson pressed the trigger and bent the rule that had kept him silent. 3 days earlier, huddled in a drafty Belgian farmhouse near the forward line, he had listened while his commanding officer, coat collar up and a voice flat, told the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, "No one shoots unless command confirms. I don't care what rolls past your sights. I don't care how close it gets. You do not disclose your position unless ordered." Hats nodded, teeth clenched. No one argued, but tension packed the air like powder in a shell. Beyond those walls, the bulge had swelled to life. On December 16, under a quilt of fog and snow that smothered sound and cradled surprise, the German army hurled its last great blow in the west. Operation Watch on the Rhine. They punched with more than 200,000 troops with over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and with surprise so complete that American lines crumpled in places like wet cardboard. Units vanished. Posts changed hands by the hour. The threat of mistaken fire from shaken rear echelons loomed as large as any gray column pushing forward. The rule came down stern and simple. Wait for orders. For Thompson, that meant he was an eye, not a gun. He and 3 crewmates were dug into a frostbitten rise overlooking a forest lane north of Noville, a junction town that guarded approaches to Bastogne. Their hide was good. Their fields of fire were long. Their view of the snow-washed valley was clear enough for a patient man to map it in his head. But their radio was fickle, and their permission to engage did not exist. Day bled into night, and back again while Thompson swept the periscope inch by inch. He traced track marks gouged into icy soil. He counted stumps scuffed bare by treads. In a thin notebook mailed from home by his mother, he sketched the shapes in the snow and kept rows of neat numbers: range, bearing, wind. None of those numbers became a shot. He once tracked a lone Panzer creeping along a ravine for an hour, jaw clenched, finger steady, until it slipped away and dusk took it. His anger then burned low and blue, but discipline was the lid that kept it from spilling over. He understood the cost of a shot sent to the wrong place at the wrong time. One bad round could murder friends he'd never meet, or tell the enemy with one bright flash exactly where to pour a storm of steel. But as the enemy's traffic thickened and the forest began to carry the clank and growl of a buildup, a different question took shape. Was silence more dangerous than sound? Thompson was not rash. He was patient and exact. He studied enemy movement the way a surveyor studies lines. He knew how German columns layered their parts, how fast armor shielded the nose, how infantry rode with the middle, how fuel and shells trailed in the tail. He knew what to strike, where to place a blow, and in what sequence. He just didn't yet know that the choice would land on his shoulders, alone. Raymond Charles Thompson did not arrive in this world wearing a uniform. He grew up under big skies, in western Kansas, where winter gales stripped paint off barns and summers baked wheat until fields split like old pottery. His father, Charles, tuned small engines in a shop that smelled of oil, hot steel, and dust. His mother, Anna, taught 7th grade math, her chalk dusting cuffs with white smears. Between gears and graph paper, he learned to see in angles. He could judge distance from the length of a silo's shadow and tell time by the slant of sun on fence wire. While other boys snapped slingshots, he built a rig with pulleys and counterweights, tinkering for hours to see how far he could fling a pebble by turning force into measure. He did not enlist to chase glory. In 1942, he signed the papers because the Army promised training, steady pay, and a path to engineering. He got the training. The pay barely covered smokes and postage. The future stretched only as far as Europe allowed. He reached Normandy at 22 with lines at the corners of his eyes that made him look older. His baptism came in the hedgerows, where the enemy could be 10 feet away behind a green wall, and you'd learn it when mouths of muzzle fire opened like orange blossoms. He watched Jimmy Delgado burn when a Panzer round found their half-track and churned it into a ditch of flame. He saw Frank Murray disappear in an instant outside St. Lo when a mine lifted the earth under him and slammed it back. After that, he set luck aside. He stopped trusting distance. He leaned on routines, on timings he could prove, on patterns that held while everything else broke. He carried a small spiral notebook in the pocket of his jacket. Every new enemy vehicle earned a sketch, neat and spare, with notes about where its vision failed and where its armor thinned. He spoke when needed and no more. Soldiers started calling him the quiet clock because when he did speak, he clipped his words, counted his seconds, and stuck to facts. On the gun, he was lethal, but not in a flashy way. He did not rush. He did not spray. He placed rounds with a craftsman's calm and a chess player's patience. The Army considered him a model gunner, disciplined, quick-thinking, level under fire. What his officers did not fully see, and what even his crew only glimpsed, was the mind behind the hands, a tactician who read a battlefield like a board, anticipating moves as much as making them. In 3 days, that mind would break a rule and reshape what his unit believed about when to hold and when to strike. The morning of December 19th arrived smothered in fog that hung low and clung to branches like breath on glass. Sound came warped. Close noises stretched and distant rumble folded in on itself. Thompson lifted the periscope and there it was, the silhouette of a tiger, unmistakable in its slab-sided menace and the long, predatory thrust of its gun. One shape became two, then more, until the column took form. 12 vehicles, perhaps more hidden by the white veil. It was a tidy armored procession, heavy in the lead, medium tanks arrayed behind, infantry carriers tucked in the middle, with supply trucks keeping station and a self-propelled anti-aircraft piece snapping at the tail. The lane they chose was stingy, barely wider than the tanks. Earthen banks hemmed them in. Trees stood so close their trunks could scrape paint. There was no room to fan out, no space to flood forward. To Thompson, that narrow channel was more than a route. It was a sprung trap. The problem lay in protocol. His radio crackled intermittently, coughed static, then went dead. Reaching higher command would mean repositioning and risking exposure. The book said, watch them pass, speak their direction, let artillery or aircraft do the bleeding. But he wasn't seeing a column drifting to the rear to rest. He was staring at a sharpened point heading for Noville. If they seized that junction, they could swing south along a back road and bite into the northern flank of the Bastogne defense. The 101st, already ringed by enemy pressure, would lose its last reliable line for food, fuel, ammo, and medicine. That would be a catastrophe measured in thousands of lives freezing and starving in the snow. The column advanced like men sure of themselves, buoyed by the belief that the Americans opposite them were shaken and too scattered to fight with cohesion. They were half right. Ray Thompson was cold and alone and anxious. He was not scattered. He was counting. He knew that a shot taken too soon would send the serpent thrashing backward into the woods. He knew that a wrong target would leave teeth, free to bite back with force his thin armor couldn't bear, but he also knew that if he laid rounds on the right spots in the right order, he could carve the column into sections and make each section a problem for the others. He could break a roll of steel into a row of obstacles. He would have to do it without a whisper from command and without anyone to cover him if it went wrong. He licked cracked lips, rolled the elevation wheel, memorized the spacing, and waited for a moment no training film had ever defined. Until that morning, he had never broken the rule about firing. Not in Louisiana maneuvers, not in the bocage, not 2 days earlier when a single Panzer wandered into his sights and his stomach told him to squeeze. But now a string of tanks crawled in front of him as if drawn by a measured hand, and he understood that patience here would be a form of self-destruction. With the radio dead, with no permission and no one to say go, he set his angle, filled his lungs, and sent an armor-piercing round on its way. He did not aim at the Tiger. He did not aim at the nose at all. He aimed at the third vehicle. The shot left the Wolverine with a crack that turned the quiet inside out. Snow flew upward in a glittering fan. The round punched into the third Panzer's side as if it were a door, and then light and smoke and shrapnel tore outward. The column stopped like a train hitting a wall. His loader drove the next shell home with blistered palms. Thompson nudged the hull 5 yards left to throw off anyone hunting for muzzle flare and squeezed again. The sixth vehicle, a half-track jammed with infantry, became a torch as its tank ruptured and flame gulped air until the snow glowed orange. Men flew like thrown coats. The Tiger in front barked orders, tried to back, but there was no space. Every machine stood bumper to plate, too tightly packed to dance. He did not stop. The next target lay farther back, a fuel truck lumbering as the eighth vehicle in line. The hit was apocalyptic. The ground jumped. A dragon's tongue rose above the tree line. Heat slapped his face even through steel and snow. Black smoke backlit the remaining tanks and turned them into shadow puppets. From a mile away, the chaos would have sounded like a regiment of guns. In truth, it was one man up front, one crew, and a chain of decisions built from scribbles in a notebook. None of the choices were lucky. All were deliberate. Months of studying how the enemy built its columns paid off now, in a pattern that was less a barrage and more a surgeon sequence. By wrecking the third vehicle, he had plugged the column near the head. By crushing the sixth, he had jammed the middle and blocked infantry from offloading in good order. By burning the eighth, he had set fire to retreat itself and marooned what was left in a canyon of flame and steel. The effect was a map of trapped possibilities. German gunners, shocked and half-blind in fog and smoke, began lashing the woods with machine gun bursts and high-explosive rounds. They chewed bark and riddled drifts where no enemy stood. The infantry dived behind wrecks that spat sparks and heat. To them, the ambush felt like an orchestra of American destroyers, 4, 8, a dozen. There was no orchestra. There was Ray, his loader, his assistant, his driver, and a hull with a thin roof and a reliable gun. He treated the forest like a marksman's range. Angles mattered. So did inches. He eased the Wolverine between saplings and stumps to take firing positions that offered shelter and a sliver of view, then shifted after every pair of shots. 10 yards here to break a line of sight, 20 yards there to make the next muzzle flash appear from a new seam in the trees. Fog and smoke did half the work. His sense of geometry did the rest. Every new thunderclap tore up another line in a field manual the Germans had sworn by. A minute earlier, the Ardennes had been a hush of ice and brittle twigs. Now it howled. Shockwaves cracked small trees and hurled dead limbs into the air like spears. Snowflakes, ash, and glittering fragments of steel drifted together and fell like lethal confetti. The fourth shot found a half-track that had finally ground its gears into reverse. The shell hit with a sound like a church bell tolling doom, and the frame rose, twisted, and returned to earth mangled. The Tiger at the front still tried to back, but the trail behind it was clogged with carcasses and flame. The formation that in open fields had been a model of discipline had here become a corridor of coffins. From his seat behind the scope, time stretched. He saw German infantry flinch as one, scatter between tree trunks, then slide and flounder on slick roots. He watched an officer climb a turret to shout and point, only to be swatted down by bursts from the Wolverine's .50 caliber, the rounds punching clean holes in cold air. Inside the M10, sweat collected under coats despite the cold. The loader's hands bled where scabbed blisters broke. The assistant gunner's voice rasped as he called numbers. The stink of burned powder, oiled steel, and hot casing mingled into a single sour breath. Thompson's pulse slowed rather than sped. Angles and seconds replaced adrenaline. He fired, shifted, fired, shifted, denying every German gunner a fixed point to paint. He sensed the enemy's growing confusion as much as saw it. Muzzle flashes struck from too many places, they thought, for one destroyer alone. He made the illusion stronger. He chose his next strike at the tail, the self-propelled flak gun that guarded the column's end. One clean shot split its crew's rhythm and left their barrels pointed only at fog. With the sting gone from the rear, he turned back toward the head and took the Tiger's tread for a target. He knew he could not reliably core its turret from that angle and range, not with his gun and the Tiger's frontal armor. He also knew a cat without feet is just another cage. The round smashed the track and peeled it like a ribbon. The Tiger shuddered and stopped, snarling but immobile, teeth bared but unable to pounce. The men inside those enemy machines were brave and trained and now poorly placed. Some tried to unlimber and push vehicles by hand. Others flung themselves into the trees to find a flanking shot. The half-platoon of infantry that had spilled from the burning carriers attempted to form a skirmish line. But the forest floor, chopped by roots and slicked by ash, defeated their rhythm. Thompson placed a high-explosive shell into a knot of trunks where muzzle ends winked, and splinters ripped outward in a devastating storm. He let the echo die, then slid the Wolverine again, so that any enemy watching would guess at a second or third American gun where there was only one shifting shadow. His driver breathed through his teeth and nursed the transmission in short, careful bursts. The assistant gunner laid bearings as if calling cadence. The loader, jaw tight, kept the gun fed with a steady clack and scrape. In the moments between shots, Ray felt his father's workshop in his hands, the press of metal, the weight of a tool that answered to the angle of the wrist, and heard his mother's lessons counting in his head, numbers stepping down to 0 and then up again as ranges and wind and lead changed. He directed fire at the places that would create the most disorder with the least expenditure. A tanker's fuel, a narrow hinge in the formation, a spot where a crater would swallow a set of wheels and multiply the delay. He had paced himself to the ammunition he carried. He resisted the urge to take trophy shots at the Tiger's turret that might announce his exact position in ricochets. He refused to waste metal on hulls already burning so hot that they were no longer threats. Between bursts, he listened for the shift in enemy fire that would tell him they had triangulated him. It did not come. The fog and the echo in his own movements kept their picture fractured. A German gunner raked a snowbank 10 yards from where Ray had been a heartbeat before, then corrected too far. Another hosed a brush line that had already emptied. Their line commander tried to rebuild cohesion with shouts that came thin and ragged through smoke. The shock at the start had become a rhythm he controlled. The crossroads did not know it yet, but every minute he held the column in place was a minute of reprieve. The enemy's timetable slipped on the ice of Ray's interruptions. He saw movement in the gap created by his first kill, the stretch where the third vehicle had blocked, and watched 2 Panzer Fees jostle in place, each trying to nose around the wreck and failing because the road was too tight for such maneuvers. He dropped around at the edge where the road met the bank and turned the soil and snow into a slick berm that made the angle worse for them. One tank slid a foot and stuck. The second's driver threw his hands toward the sky as if a curse might widen the path. Nothing did. The strike on the fuel truck had done more than block. Fire climbed branches and licked at twigs and chewed bark into charcoal. The air's bite grew thicker and tasted of burned rubber. Ray's world narrowed to sights and numbers in the brief glow of the muzzle, but a small, persistent thread of thought wound through. If he had held his tongue in his fire, this snake of armor would have reached Noville whole and quick, and what it would have done there would have laid ruin in a different set of woods. He was disobeying the letter to keep the spirit alive. He felt no pride in the act, only the relief of doing the math that made the best sense in a bad set of variables. The German anti-aircraft gun at the tail hiccuped once more as someone tried to bring it back online. A second corrective round turned its platform into a splintered raft. The Tiger's main gun thundered blind and crushed a tree 3 trunks to Ray's right. In the shower of broken limbs, he heard panicked shouting that had lost the edge of command. A squad attempted a crawl to the flank that, if completed, would have put eyes on the Wolverine's roof. Ray read the move coming and peppered the path with .50 caliber fire that chewed their cover into chips and forced the survivors flat. The forest swallowed a cry and gave back only the whisper of falling ash. He was not fighting a duel with a single tank. He was running a problem set across a living target, each shot changing the next equation. His loader's arms trembled now from effort, and his own right shoulder ached from recoil driven through it again and again. He redistributed the workload, slowed his pace for 2 lungfuls of air, then sped up for 3 shots in swift succession, to keep the enemy guessing and his crew able. In the gap, he looked again at the notebook open on his lap, pages damp and curling at the corners, and added 2 words under a quick diagram of the column he'd learned to split. Sequence matters. They, the men in gray, concluded they had met not one but several American tank destroyers arranged in a perfect trap. Ray could almost hear their estimate harden. Some swore it was 4, others said 8. This misjudgment was his ally and he nurtured it. He sent a round from a shallow angle that made the muzzle flash appear to come from a different notch in the ridge. He moved in silence. No shouted orders, only tapped knuckles and quick nods to keep their ears as misled as their eyes. He never let 2 successive shots fall from the same place. By the time his gun fell briefly quiet, the column no longer resembled the neat diagram with which it had entered the trees. It had become a line of broken shapes and anxious men, cut into segments that could neither flee nor press. The Tiger growled impotent where its track lay black and slack. Flames paled as fuel burned off and left char and smoke. The heavy silence that follows fury began to edge in as German small arms fire tapered. He listened for the sound of engines catching and found few. He listened for the gathering thunder of enemy artillery and heard only the forest's exhausted breath. He had bent a rule designed for control, because control had already failed elsewhere. He had traded one risk, exposure, for another, paralysis, and found the result, motion. The crossroads for the hour that mattered stayed out of the enemy's hands. He let that knowledge sit without savor. There would be a reckoning after. There always is. A captain might rage at the breach in protocol. A colonel might measure outcomes and quietly take notes. Ray would write lines in his notebook that no one else would read, charting what combination of strikes had made the difference so that if he saw such a serpent again, he would know exactly where to cut. In the cold that seeped into his bones once the shooting slackened, he thought of Kansas, of a barn door rattling in winter wind and the way his father's hand steadied it to latch. He thought of a chalkboard and angles and of how shadows told distance. Then he folded those memories back where they belonged and checked his crew. One by one, blood on palms, hoarse throat, a scuffed boot jammed against a pedal, and felt the Wolverine's engine a living, dependable beat under him. Outside, the fog took back the shapes it had lent to men and machines. Inside, he returned to the role the manual assigned. Quiet, watching, waiting for orders that, when they finally came, would arrive late to a fight already decided by someone who knew when silence protects and when it kills. Rumors rolled down the ridge like thunder about American guns hidden in the hills. Batteries said to be bristling behind the trees. Yet none existed in that slice of front. The truth was leaner and colder. A single M10 Wolverine crouched in a winter hollow. A 3-man crew working in hard silence, and a gunner expected to obey the chain of command. 30 minutes into the contact, the lane had become a corridor of flame. At least 5 enemy vehicles lay wrecked beyond repair. 3 more sat frozen in place with tracks torn or engines dead, and the rear echelons, fuel and support drivers, had already turned tail and sprinted back along the icy track. The Tiger finally swung its turret, the long barrel hunting for the last muzzle flash on the ridge. Thompson didn't twitch. He measured time. He knew the big cat's thickest plates were front-facing, that its belly and flanks were vulnerable in motion, and that the instant a turn peeled open a sliver of side armor, a window appeared for anyone bold enough to take it. His 5th round hammered into that seam. Light burst inward, then outward. A heartbeat later, the ammunition cooked off, and the turret leapt skyward in a fiery crown before thudding into the snow yards away. The concussion rocked the far end of the column and jostled the flak gun off its stance. Its crew, rattled and ash-faced, abandoned the mount and vanished among the trunks. Smoke crawled low through the timber like ground fog, and what had been a steady artery of armor became a choked, burning tourniquet. One of the crew glanced over and muttered almost to himself whether a court-martial would meet them at dusk. Thompson didn't answer. He drove the next shell into the breach. The work was unfinished. Hours after the shooting stopped under a canvas roof that panted in the wind, a captured German lieutenant sat smeared with soot, coat charred at the hem, eyes blown wide by shock, and tried to explain. He launched into broken English that stumbled and stalled. Many guns, he kept saying. Maybe 6, maybe more. Full battery. The American interrogators traded quiet looks. There had been no battery on that slope. There had not even been a full section of tank destroyers. There was one M10, one calm gunner acting without a green light from anyone above. Other prisoners told other stories. Some swore paratroopers with handheld rockets had staged the attack from the trees. A few insisted mines and booby traps did the real work, as if sabotage had replaced gunnery. One boy, barely old enough to shave, testified that he saw 3 muzzle flashes from 3 separate angles. The truth was simpler and stranger. Thompson shifted position after nearly every shot, sowing confusion like a tailor sows hems. Fear filled the gaps in perception. Veteran commanders described American tank shapes deeper in the woods that were never there. It was not cowardice. It was human vision buckling under smoke, noise, and surprise. They refused to accept that one destroyer could hit with such timing and balance and leave a battalion's worth of destruction. In a sense, their disbelief made sense. This was not brute smashing. It was surgical interruption, a rhythm of strikes that used doctrine against the men who had learned it. The pattern mattered. Thompson didn't pound at the front. He carved the structure. He selected the 3rd, then the 6th, then the 8th vehicle. Not by accident, but by plan. Blocked the head, jammed the middle, torched the tail's lifeline, and the column's order collapsed under its own weight. German training preached that Americans were slow to adapt, sluggish without explicit orders, and effective only when stacked in numbers. Thompson inverted that expectation. He thought like the officer he would never become, then hit like a phantom that seemed to stand in several places at once. One prisoner insisted the trees themselves spat fire. Another swore he heard a whistling through the branches, a sound that might have been the hiss of shells or simply the wind, amplified and bent by fear. When U.S. troops finally pushed up to clear the road later that day, even grizzled men stopped and stared. The scene looked like a composite of airstrikes and artillery. Steel bodies stacked like dominoes, frames fused by heat, wheels twisted like soft wire, tracks buckled sideways and gouged deep scars in the frozen ground. Between smoking hulks lay figures stiffened by cold, hands still latched around rifle stocks. What stood out most was absence. There were no American dead in the snow, because only one gunner had fired. Survivors from the German side, when they had breath to talk, renamed the episode with a phrase that stuck: Die Geisterbatterie, the ghost battery. For 2 days, Thompson waited to be led away. When the last echoes died and the air thinned and the resin tang of burned pine drifted from the ridge, he sat inside the Wolverine and went still. The loader nudged a canteen toward him. He didn't drink. Adrenaline bled out and something heavier moved in to take its place. Rules existed for a reason. He had stepped past them and fired without permission. He knew that hot wrecks glowing on a road didn't erase administrative ink. Back at battalion headquarters, he delivered his report. Captain Langston, a Pittsburgh steelworker type with shoulders like an anvil, paged through the document in silence. Sketches, measurements, a clean diagram of the sequence 3rd, 6th, 8th stared back from the paper. Anger and disbelief fought on his face. If this had gone wrong, he said finally, voice flat with fatigue. If one shell had clipped friendlies. Thompson nodded. No offer of excuse, no bath of logic, just, I knew what I saw. Langston's jaw worked. Nobody authorized this, Thompson. You understand? I do. No reprimand came, not yet. Get some rack time, Langston said, as if the words tasted odd. I have to send this upstairs. When final word came, it slid sideways. Langston went in ready to eat a reprimand and carry a smaller one to his gunner. The division commander listened, weighed, then said, Don't brief this widely. Not yet, but tell your man we'll be watching his work. No medal, no trial. Instead, a quiet assignment followed. Teach what you did. They didn't call it brilliance, and they didn't hang a hero's label around his neck. They asked for diagrams. Thompson drafted clean lines that explained how to stop a moving mass by pulling specific pins. Those diagrams found their way to Fort Sill, where the artillery school filed them under lessons worth teaching. The realization arrived not with brass bands, but with paper cuts. They were not simply excusing him. They were studying him. Weeks later, Langston found him cleaning the breech of a recoilless rifle, palms dark with grease, and leaned against the door. I was ready to report you for flat-out insubordination, he said. Thompson looked up. Langston gave a half shrug. Then I read a line in your notes. Controlled collapse. What did you mean? Thompson wiped his hands and let the words settle. If you pull the right stone from a wall, he said, the rest gives way. The trick is knowing where to pull. Langston smiled, a thin slice of fatigue and respect. "Next time you decide to take down a wall, give me 5 minutes warning." Thompson didn't grin back. He nodded. The moment had never felt like conquest to him. It was a result, one solution to a bad problem, something that could as easily have gone the other direction. War sometimes punishes disobedience. Sometimes it harvests it. The approach that rattled the forest that morning did more than wreck a column. It bent doctrine. Thompson never auditioned to be remembered. He kept no war diary and posed for no cameras. After the armistice, he drifted back to Kansas, married Helen from a town over, and opened a repair shop off a 2-lane near Dodge City. He fixed tractors, poured concrete for silo foundations, and taught his son to love angles by dragging a stick through dust and sketching triangles in the yard. He never called himself a hero. Others did that lifting for him. Years after the Winter Offensive, the Army taught a principle with a lofty name: asymmetrical engagement sequencing, which boiled down to a clean, hard truth. Don't punch the nose. Break the skeleton. As a case study, they used a snowy road outside Noville. Overhead maps showed blackened carapaces at measured intervals, firing lines penciled across the page, impact points marked with neat circles. The lesson sat in manuals few officers ever read end to end. Students at Fort Sill and later at Fort Benning learned it anyway, because it spared lives and reshaped what a single crew could do. The lever was not raw firepower. It was geometry, logic, and the will to act when the official voice on the wire had gone silent. A colonel who, as a young lieutenant, had studied that engagement later summarized it in a sentence that stayed with his own students. He didn't break orders. He moved beyond them. Paradox nested in those words. A man who refused to be paralyzed by a failing net became a template for agility under fire. In the years that followed, pieces of Thompson's informal method seeped into Cold War playbooks. Tank destroyer crews, even those rebadged and re-equipped for a different era, trained to dissect armored columns on the highways of Eastern Europe if the day ever came. The concept was tidy in writing and hard in practice. Create artificial choke points by cutting strategic joints in the enemy's formation, then let the adversary's own devotion to discipline keep them trapped. Revolutionary ideas sometimes arrive from laboratories. This one came from a farm kid who hadn't set foot in a university. Decades later, a historian digging through dusty cartons of after-action reports found Captain Langston's original paperwork, the pages softened by time and stamped with a faded stripe of red. He followed the trail to a low house on a quiet street, where Thompson in his 80s lived with Helen and a cat named Murphy who ignored strangers. The researcher asked about the cold morning in the Ardennes. Thompson took his time, pulled on the past, and finally said, "I remember the trees, the stillness before the first shot, like the whole world stopped to listen." He did not speak of triumph or shame. He used words like measure and need. When the question turned to orders, he answered, "By the time the radio behaved, it would have been too late." He paused and added, "I didn't shatter the rules. I stepped past them just long enough to do the job." That answer never appeared in official volumes or public speeches. It settled instead into the memory of one listener and, through him, into the minds of those who wanted to understand why one quiet decision matters. He did not win the war. Wars seldom hinge on one pair of hands, but he held a road that had to be held, spared a column of paratroopers whose supplies would have thinned to nothing, and preserved a small slice of time in which the line did not break. In war, moments like that weigh more than they look. They carry forward other outcomes. He reminded a sprawling institution that courage has several dialects. Sometimes it shouts. Sometimes it is a whisper measured in yards and seconds, a calculation settled under a grime-slick glove, and the steady squeeze of a trigger. Not rebellion, but duty refined to a point. Years later, instructors taught students to read a column the way Thompson had. Not as steel to be smashed head-on, but as a structure held together by a few critical joints. They practiced targeting logic on sand tables with tiny models, poking holes in imagined convoys until the same cascade revealed itself. Block here, jam there, starve that segment, and the entire moving beast stopped moving. They told young officers that orders are the spine of a military, and initiative is the muscle that lets the spine bend instead of snap. They told crews that radios fail and snow swallows sound, and that sometimes the right choice is the one that keeps others alive, even if you must explain it to a captain later with grease still under your nails. Back in Kansas, The shop door rattled in winter winds the way barn doors had when he was a boy. He replaced belts, straightened bent shafts, and ran a careful finger along pitted bearing races, listening to metal the way he used to listen to engines in rain. Neighbors brought machines and left with them running smoother, the same way crews once came to him with questions about sequencing and left with diagrams folded into their pockets. He never embellished. He trimmed stories down to bone. To the boy asking if he had been frightened, he would say, "Cold, mostly." To the man wanting the names of tanks, he would list them plainly and stop there. His life leaned back toward usefulness and away from ceremony. When the historian mailed a transcript of their conversation with a note of thanks, Thompson tucked it into the same drawer that held his notebook from the front, a worn spiral with pages rippled by damp and edges stained with oil. On one page, a triangle marked with distances. On another, the simple sketch of a road and a column and 3 dark crosses at the 3rd, 6th, and 8th positions. Next to it, in a hand still neat despite a tremor, the phrase that once turned Langston's head: controlled collapse. He had shown how now others could choose when. At reunions, he rarely spoke about the winter. He asked after other men's families, sat for a while, then slipped away before speeches. Those who knew the story nodded without making a circle around him. Such quiet suited him and also honored the others who had frozen and bled on days when no clever pattern could rescue them. He kept his ghosts folded small. The cat slept on the chair by the window. The light in the afternoon bent across the floorboards the way it did on clear prairie days when the sky looked endless and uncomplicated. Remember him not for the count of wrecks, which history can brand and unbrand depending on who writes the paragraph, but for the way he stepped into a gap that should have closed. One gunner, one choice, one pattern that pried apart a formidable instrument built to roll through snow and fear. An armored column knelt because geometry and nerve met at the right instant. That's not myth. It's a lesson in how a single mind can sometimes steady a larger hand.